Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. It's time for a new batch of historical mysteries. And tonight, the various stories I will tell you are all stories of ghost ships. Some fictional and real ships that lost their crews and wandered on the seas by themselves for days, weeks, months, and sometimes even years or decades. But before we begin our mystery night, I would like to take a few seconds of your time to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project, get more of it, and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute financially directly to our work. If you join, you will gain access to various new features. For example, you will have the option to listen to all episodes with or without background sounds and receive regular bonus episodes. We already offer 8 exclusive episodes to our Patreons. The latest one is about the Lighthouse of Alexandria. This is the first of the 7 wonders of the ancient world that we will explore. And once completed, they will all be edited together to create a 4-hour-long story. In addition, you will have the capability to download all these audios and participate in selecting future topics. We also offer advanced releases and updates on upcoming episodes. We hope to see you there soon so that we can continue developing Lights Out Library, which we thoroughly enjoy. You will find a link in the description box and the first comment pinned under the video. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you fall asleep and wish to resume the video later, or jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are also listed in the description and pinned in the first comment, as well as links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Amazon Music, which may be better suited for you. But before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to leave all your worries behind as we embark on this adventure together. Now, assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a little bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath, and when you exhale, do it slowly. And feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, it's time to explore. So let's get started with the first story about maybe the most famous of all ghost ships, the Flying Dutchman. 200 years ago, at a time when sailing ships still dominated the seas and had not yet been replaced by steamships, sailing on the oceans was still lengthy and quite a risky business. One never knew when one would arrive exactly. Ships were fragile with their wooden hulls that could break. They could run aground or sink. And storms or other violent phenomena were the dread of sailors. The oceans, the seas, were still this mysterious, gigantic expanse where you could encounter all sorts of dangers, and no one knew what kind of monsters hid under the surface in depths that had never been explored and not even sounded. So men at sea would look at the sky, at the birds, at the color of water, or at the changes of the winds to try to anticipate and not lose their way. But in the cold waters of the Atlantic, off the coasts of South Africa, there was one sight that was said to be particularly dreaded: the appearance of an old ship from the age of sail, strangely glowing with a ghostly light, her sails shredded, and apparently moved and shaken by ancient winds that had long stopped blowing. The Flying Dutchman, the ghost ship that announced violent storms and maybe the impending doom of those who were unfortunate enough to see her. Repeatedly in the 19th and 20th centuries, sailors claimed to have seen the Flying Dutchman. Authors of travel stories talked about her. So did poets and novelists, and the ship became a celebrity, a legend even. But where does it come from? What part of this is real and what is exaggerated or invented? Let's take a look at what we know. As the name Flying Dutchman indicates, this legend has its roots in a particular time period, the period when the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic, more precisely, was a great maritime power in the 17th century, a time period when Dutch ships sailed all the oceans of the planet. They opened new routes and they traded all around the world, from North America, where they founded colonies like New Amsterdam, better known today as New York City, to the Caribbean, the coasts of Africa, the Indian Ocean, and as far east as China or Japan, where for a long time the Dutch had a trade monopoly. For a few decades in the 17th century, Amsterdam became the largest international trade center, and the Netherlands enjoyed the prosperity that left traces in architecture, intellectual life, scientific development, or the arts. Just to cite a few examples, philosophers like Spinoza, painters like Rembrandt or Vermeer, and dozens of less famous artists of the 17th century were born and worked and prospered in the Netherlands. But why this age of prosperity for the Dutch? And what is the relation with the Flying Dutchman? To understand this, we need to make a bit of history. In the 16th century, the Netherlands were part of the Empire of the Habsburgs, the dynasty that controlled big chunks of Europe, Spain, Austria, Hungary, parts of modern Germany and France, and most of what one day would become the states of Belgium and the Netherlands. The future Belgium and the Netherlands had entered the Habsburgs' possession because Charles V, who reigned all over these lands, had inherited the Duchy of Burgundy, of which they were a part of or associated with. This European empire of the Habsburgs was completed by a fast-growing colonial empire overseas, especially in the Americas. Spain had established its presence there, and its American colonies in the 16th century began to produce colossal revenues. The Habsburg Empire eventually split into two branches of the family: the Habsburgs of Austria, who kept Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, which is the historical name of the modern Czech Republic, and another important family asset, the title of Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. This loose association with German states, this imperial title was elective, but for almost 300 years, They did what they had to do to keep it in their hands. And these Habsburgs of Austria would stay on the throne until the 20th century. Therefore, the abdication of the last Habsburg emperor was one of the consequences of the First World War. The second branch, the Spanish Habsburgs, was left with the global colonial empire and, in Europe, with Spain. At the time, it consisted mostly of two main kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, plus the remains of the Burgundian heritage, including the Netherlands. But in the second half of the 16th century, the Netherlands were increasingly willing to get rid of the Habsburgs' rule for various reasons. The first one was religious. Different provinces of the Netherlands had become Protestant after the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, whereas the Habsburgs were Catholic monarchs, and at the time Europe was shaken by religious conflicts. Many kings would not tolerate that their subjects adopted what they considered to be heretical beliefs. So the Protestant subjects of the Catholic kings were always at risk of being bullied, at best, or persecuted, and vice versa. There were also economic or financial reasons. The King of Spain, Philip II, was at war constantly with other powers, the French, the English, the Ottomans, and to fund these conflicts on top of using a lot of gold that came from America, the crown heavily taxed its subjects and their trade. Paying hefty taxes to a distant king in Madrid that you don't like and who doesn't like you either, to fund a policy that doesn't benefit you, was obviously something unpleasant for the Dutch, to say the least. And these political, religious, and economic factors converged to lead to a rebellion of several provinces of the Spanish Netherlands against the crown of Spain, against Philip II. In 1568, 7 provinces formed an alliance and a new republic, officially the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, commonly called the Dutch Republic. This was the predecessor state to the modern Netherlands. This cessation from the Habsburgs' territory delighted all the enemies of the Habsburgs, and there were many at the time. This started a long, very long war of 80 years with the Spanish. The war was not constant. It was more on and off. They didn't fight continuously, but it officially ended only 80 years later, in 1648, at the end of another conflict, the 30 Years' War. After that, Spain officially recognized the existence of an independent Dutch Republic. Now, being part of the Habsburg sphere of influence, when Spain was discovering America, had also left traces in the Netherlands. The most prominent explorers and conquistadors who worked for the crown of Spain or Portugal to explore these new lands discovered overseas were from the Iberian Peninsula, or sometimes from Italy, like Christopher Columbus. And so were most of the troops sent in the 16th century. But there were also individuals from all over Europe, especially Habsburg Europe, who were involved in Spanish expeditions and exploration initiatives, Austrian, German, Dutch. And so the experience of this new world for Dutch people went beyond the frontiers of Spain, especially in a part of Europe like the Netherlands. that already had a maritime tradition. Another way that colonization and conquest of America impacted the rest of Europe was through the inflow of wealth, especially the mountains of gold and silver seized and then mined in Mexico and South America. When these precious metals arrived in Spain, they were spent on all sorts of goods that the relatively small Spanish economy could not provide. So it stimulated activity well beyond the frontiers of Spain. France, Italy, Germany, and England also benefited economically, and being part of the Habsburg Empire, and already an industrious region since the Middle Ages, the Netherlands got significantly wealthier thanks to Spanish colonization. Actually, an economic and artistic Renaissance movement started in the Netherlands and Flanders, which were all Habsburg regions at the time, after Italy, but before any other part of Europe. So for all these reasons, based on the criteria of the time, 16th century Netherlands was a relatively modern, outward-looking, and prosperous region. The northern part of the Spanish Netherlands had converted to the new Reformed faith, Protestantism. At least a significant portion of the population and the economic elite. Philip II did not intend to let the Dutch go and break free, so there was intense repression against their heretical inclinations, and also against their will for independence after 1568. Religious animosity and repression across Europe was obviously a threat to the young Dutch Republic, but it also contributed to its prosperity, because many Protestant traders from Flanders, at the time still Spanish, would refuge to the north in the Dutch Republic, and so did other Protestants from Catholic kingdoms, where they were at risk of being mistreated or persecuted. Many also came from France. The Huguenots, many of them, as much as they could, came with their business and their capital. With this context in a nutshell, you have the main pillars of the Dutch surge or miracle of the late 16th and 17th century. An inflow of capital, a modern economy for the time, a connection to world exploration and maritime trade that started before independence, and also an adventurous community of sailors, explorers, and navigators willing to travel the world and get rich fast. On top of that, the Dutch Republic had quite a bit of luck too. For decades, neighboring countries that could have been threats were busy dealing with their own internal conflicts. Religious infighting like in England, but even more in France, and external wars, especially against Spain. All of this left the Dutch Republic relatively safe in Europe and hands-free to do what they wanted on the oceans of the world, like attacking or replacing Spanish and even more Portuguese settlements. Portugal was an ally of Spain, and the two countries even shared the same king, Philip II, for years, so that put Portugal and the Dutch technically at war too. Actually, rather than Spain, the main victim of the Dutch expansion overseas would be Portugal, which had established its own trade network to the east a century earlier, and it lost large parts of it to the Dutch. They were active in the Atlantic, They established a presence in the Caribbean and founded colonies in North America like New Amsterdam. They also took a big role in the slave trade, transferring many enslaved Africans to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. When this triangular trade between Europe, West Africa, and America was booming, but a lot of their attention and efforts were oriented towards the Far East. Alongside Atlantic trades like slaves, gold, and colonial crops, sugar, tobacco, dyes, cotton, an extremely lucrative trade was the spice trade with India and the Spice Islands in what is now Indonesia. There was no Suez Canal at the time, obviously. So to get there, the strategic stop was the southern tip of Africa, hence an intense interest of the Dutch to have a presence there in what would become South Africa. The long-lasting Dutch cultural and human presence in South Africa comes from there. In various coastal trading posts and islands of the Indian Ocean, or in South Africa too, the Dutch just expelled the Portuguese and replaced them. Portugal was unable to defend its trade empire at the time because the country was overstretched. Portugal was a small country with only about 2 million inhabitants, not enough to defend and develop possessions all around the world that included Brazil and South America, and dozens of trading posts and forts between Europe and the Far East, alongside thousands and thousands of miles of trade routes. At the time, the Dutch had become more aggressive, better armed, and more innovative. The Portuguese had been extraordinary sailors and pioneers in maritime exploration, but they had now lost their edge. They no longer discovered new lands and sailing techniques. For example, the Portuguese used to cross the Indian Ocean following the coastlines or jumping from island to island. The Dutch discovered a new route that was much faster to the Spice Islands to Indonesia, a route that passed south of the Indian Ocean. This new route, the Brouwer route, used the powerful winds at the south of the Indian Ocean. So ships departed South Africa sailing straight to the east, as if they were trying to go to Australia. And only a few hundred miles before reaching Australia, they turned north and reached Java, the main Dutch base in Indonesia. On paper, that is on a map, this route was not shorter than the Portuguese route, but thanks to the winds, it was way faster. Voyage time between the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa and Java was reduced in the 17th century to about 6 months versus almost 12 months previously. In trade, you can imagine the big advantage it gives you. So the Dutch became the dominant power on the spice routes at the expense of the Portuguese, who refocused on Brazil and keeping what remained of their African and Asian holdings. But they no longer dominated this trade. This is where we come back, the Flying Dutchman. In order to dominate this trade with the other side of the planet, the Dutch needed fast and solid ocean-going ships. There could be several kinds of intercontinental trade ships. They evolved over time, but in the 17th century, a type of vessel that was extensively employed by the Dutch was the flute or flute. Flutes were initially designed in the Dutch Republic, and they had several advantages. For ocean-going ships at the time, they had the best space-to-crew ratio, meaning that they could transport a lot of goods at a competitive price because there would not be as many sailors as on other ships. They were also relatively cheap to produce because they were only designed for trade. A dominant type of oceanic ship in the 16th century had been the galleon, which could be converted from trade to warship and vice versa. This can be convenient in highly disputed and dangerous waters, but it also meant that these ships were heavier, more expensive to make, and less optimized for cargo. Along the 17th century, an emerging trend in shipbuilding was the increased specialization of ships. Trade vessels and warships formed two increasingly different groups, and the Dutch were at the forefront of this evolution, which gave them an edge in trade. The Flying Dutchman was believed to be one of these flutes, a medium-sized fast cargo ship designed to travel between East Asia and Europe. Now, who owned and sent away these ships? Some were owned by individual traders, but when it came to trade and colonization with East Asia or America, European countries in the 17th century used chartered companies, private businesses that received the monopoly from a state, and these companies were typically traded on a stock market. Anyone with the means could become a shareholder. The Dutch East India Company, also known as a VOC, was a precursor and an example of such companies. The VOC was actually the first joint stock company in the world. That is to say, the first business whose shares could be bought and sold by shareholders on the market. But there would also be English and French equivalents. So the VOC received from the government of the Dutch Republic the monopoly of Dutch trade and colonization from South Africa to all of Asia. And this monopoly came with huge powers, almost the powers of a government. The company could obviously own its own ships. It could buy and sell goods, but also create and own colonies, deal with other states in its area of influence. It could go to war. It had its own private army, and this VOC organized the expansion of the Dutch Empire in Asia from the island of Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, to Java, and all the way to Japan. For decades, the VOC operated, generating major profits for the benefit of its shareholders. The Flying Dutchman would have been a ship of the VOC. So, with a captain and a crew employed by the company to trade between the Netherlands and the Spice Islands, a journey of thousands and thousands of miles that lasted several months. I told you the Flying Dutchman would have been a flout, but it would have also been an East Indiaman. East Indiaman is not a particular type of ship. It's a generic term for trade vessels that traveled from Europe to Asia. So there were East Indiamen from other countries too. There is no record of an actual East Indiaman called the Flying Dutchman that would have sailed in the 17th century, or in the 18th century for that matter. In the second half of the 18th century, the rumor that a ghost ship had been sighted at sea. An old Dutch East Indiaman started to spread in some ports and on some ships. The time of Dutch maritime dominance had come to an end a century earlier, and the rising naval and colonial power of the time was now the United Kingdom. So, for sailors of the late 18th century, evoking a Dutch flute, an Indiaman, was reminiscing of times long gone, like when in 2024 we evoke a transatlantic liner of the early 20th century. We know of this rumor about the Flying Dutchman because it appeared in travel stories, a popular genre of books at the time. People were curious about the world, which to most Europeans was still a mysterious place they would never see with their own eyes. In the accounts of various authors, many of whom were not known to be trustworthy, the Flying Dutchman is mentioned as a story that circulated among sailors. One in 1790 says that the ship had one day come to the Cape in South Africa in distress, and the crew of the Flying Dutchman wanted to get into harbor to be protected from a storm. But they couldn't get a pilot to conduct the ship, and so she was lost. After which, as a ghost ship, it began to reappear in very bad weather, announcing serious trouble. 5 years later, in 1795, in another travel account that told the story of a journey from Great Britain to Australia, the Flying Dutchman was mentioned again. Not to really say that it existed, but as the report of a superstition that circulated among sailors. This account was repeated yet in another book in 1803, another travel story, but introducing a little variant. This time the crew of the Flying Dutchman would have been punished for a crime, an unspecified crime, maybe piracy or revolt, and the murder of their officers. For their crime, they would have been sentenced to wander on the ocean till the period of their penance expired. And apparently it was a long period, because the Flying Dutchman was still there decades after the fact. In the early 19th century, the years 1800 to 1810, the Flying Dutchman transitioned from travel stories to literature, essentially in the works of British and Irish authors, including Walter Scott. It was mentioned in poems, and the concept of a ghost ship seduced. It came with the rise in popularity of Gothic stories all along the 19th century: Frankenstein, vampires, abandoned castles, monsters. A ghost ship was logical in that company. In the 1820s, there was a play called The Flying Dutchman, or The Phantom Ship, a nautical drama. And this play also contributed to its fame. But the biggest work that made The Flying Dutchman a celebrity was the opera by Richard Wagner, titled The Flying Dutchman, in 1843. Since then, with further mentions in fantasy novels or in films, like recently in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, the Flying Dutchman became a well-known name, but a fictional name, because there was never any factual trace of a flute or any other type of ship of that name that would have gotten lost. The Flying Dutchman may have started as a rumor among sailors. That looks possible. Maybe because someone invented that story one day and it was appealing enough to stick around. Or it could have even been invented from the start in these travel stories of the late 18th century, between authors who copied each other. These types of travel accounts are not known for their accuracy. They had begun to become more trustworthy in the late 18th century, more credible than their predecessors of past centuries. But they were still notoriously exaggerated and partly fictional because their authors wanted attention and good sales. So, if the public was willing to read larger-than-life exotic stories, they were happy to provide them. But even though this ship is fictional, it doesn't mean it had no connection at all to reality, to history. It is a product of this particular period of Dutch maritime expansion, and it is also believed that the story was inspired by an existing 17th century Dutch captain, a man called Bernard Fokke. There is little known about him except that Fokke was real and he appeared in multiple sources, including accounting books. The records of the period, like travel logs, the records of the Dutch VOC, the East India Company, the logs of ports, all of this makes it possible to check and estimate the magnitude of this 17th century trade, or, more anecdotically, to find historical captains and ships. There was no Flying Dutchman lost at sea, but there was this Captain Bernard Fokke, who was famous for the speed of his trips to the Far East. It seems that once he completed a journey from Amsterdam to Java in a bit more than 3 months. We know it through letters that were sent from Amsterdam to Java, and they were dated and delivered in this period of time. They could have been tampered with for publicity, but still, Fokke had this reputation for extreme speed to the point that the nickname Flying Dutchman could have suited him well. And it seems that long before the legend of the Flying Dutchman spread, there were rumors that Fokke was in league with the devil. He would have obtained these navigation skills or that uncanny speed by selling his soul to the devil in a kind of Faustian pact, if you will. So maybe this aura of the supernatural helped give birth to the Flying Dutchman legend. In any case, with its connection to the age of sail, to the exploration of the world, to histories of piracy that were added to the legend later, the Flying Dutchman provided a template for fictional ghost ships. But it is not alone. Let's now leave the port of Amsterdam, the Cape in South Africa, and the spice roads, and go to South America, to Chile, to discover another legendary ghost ship, the Caleuche. In the south of Chile, the coast of South America is very uneven, with many islands. From the Pacific Ocean, you can see the wilderness of Patagonia and the first peaks of the Andes in the distance, at least when it's not too misty. Even though it is South America, you can forget about transparent Caribbean waters, Brazilian beaches with palm trees, or the hot weather of the Amazonian forest. Here, at the southern tip of the world, climate is rather harsh, especially in winter. It is wet, and the vegetation reminds one of Oregon or Washington, or the Pacific coasts of Canada. Long before the Panama Canal was open, all ships that needed to travel between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans had to pass to the south of South America, around Cape Horn. When they arrived in the Pacific, coming from the Atlantic, they would travel north following this wild coastline, impatient to reach warmer and more welcoming waters. In this region of the world, there have been inhabitants for thousands of years, and there is an archipelago, a group of islands that you would barely notice looking at a map because it follows the coastline of Chile. The main island of this archipelago is called Chiloe, and in this place, the legend of the Caleuche was born. Nobody really knows when, possibly centuries ago. The Caleuche would be a sailing ship that sometimes emerges from the mist around Chiloe, a European sailing ship of the 17th or 18th century. Comes from the Mapudungun, the language of the native Mapuche people. Calutun means transform, and the suffix che means people. So Caleuche would be translated as transformed people. And indeed, the crew of the Caleuche is really particular. There are various versions of this myth that are not necessarily compatible. Some say that the crew likes to party, and the appearance of the ship would always be accompanied by music, joyful voices, speaking in an undefined language. The ship and her crew would be stuck in time in a never-ending celebration. Other versions say that the crew is not particularly ghostly or immaterial, and the sailors like to disembark in ports, especially where there are women. An old legend mentions that the crew had a deal with various shopkeepers of Chiloe, who had daughters. They would come ashore and party with the girls, and before leaving, they would fill the shops with goods as payment. This is how the quick fortune made by local traders would have been explained. They were protected by the Caleuche. But no one really knew what price they really paid for this protection and what the cost would be for their immortal souls. The ship is also said to be able to sail faster than any other ship, making it unreachable if it doesn't want to be caught. But the Caleuche is not necessarily a sinister ship. She also helps assist castaways, and is not known to be particularly malevolent, as long as local sailors show respect. When at sea, they mustn't sing too loud, or scream, or act disorderly. Otherwise, the crew of the Caleuche would be annoyed and could decide to appear or hide rocks to make the troublemakers wreck. Rather than threatening, the Caleuche is a mysterious presence that has been credited with plenty of phenomena like unexplained wreckages, sudden arrival of mist, weird noises that were heard at sea, or Spanish expeditions that disappeared after passing Cape Horn. The timeline of this legend is also mysterious. It could have been an old native legend that was reshaped with a European ship when settlers arrived. Could have also been an adaptation of the Flying Dutchman legend in the 18th or 19th century. Dutch privateers were once active in this part of the world, including an expedition that captured Chiloe for a short time in 1600. The memory of this presence could have been reactivated when the story of the Flying Dutchman reached this remote part of Chile. The local legend would have appeared as a reaction to the legend of the Flying Dutchman. Or maybe the explanation is more trivial than that. The Caleuche could have been used as a joke, or as a cover for smuggling activities. The discreet delivery of goods on beaches and small islands of the archipelago at night to avoid taxes in ports. All this nightly discreet traffic around the island would have given birth to the legend of the Caleuche. Maybe more than others, this one is very ambivalent. The ship is sometimes presented as a benevolent entity helping castaways or becoming a happy eternal home for the dead at sea. Other times it is more sinister. The Caleuche would attract sailors and fishermen with her music and enslave them forever to serve on board. Of course, these two coexisting visions of the ship are not compatible. In yet another version, the Caleuche is the boat of the witches of Chiloe, who use her to make unholy parties and reinforce their magical abilities. In any case, the ship remains inaccessible to the curious. It can either dive underwater or disappear in the mist, or take the appearance of a floating tree trunk, and the crew can turn into sea lions to divert attention. It remains a complete mystery. Ghost ships are not all fictional. There are real abandoned ships that have remained at sea for weeks, sometimes months, or even years. Here is an example of that. The SS Baychimo, spotted almost 40 years after it was abandoned in the cold waters of northern Canada. The Baychimo was, and maybe still is, because there is no formal proof that she sank, even though it now looks very likely, and we'll see why. A cargo steamer built in 1914 in Sweden. The ship was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, which is a well-known name in Canada because nowadays the Hudson's Bay Company is a retailer often referred to as the Bay or La Baie in Quebec. But the company is several centuries old and is actually the oldest corporation in Canada. It found its origins in colonial times when it was set up by fur traders to collect fur in and around Hudson Bay, this giant gulf to the north of Canada that nowadays is surrounded by the provinces of Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and Nunavut. For much of its existence, the company was in the business of trading fur and supplying the small towns, trading posts, and local communities that lived around the bay. This was at the start, but the business expanded to all of Canada, so the company was by far the main buyer of the furs that were hunted by trappers and native tribes. The company followed technical progress and transition from sails to steam. In the early 20th century, it was still operating its historical business, and it is the reason why it acquired the Baychimo. The ship had been built initially to serve on trading routes between Hamburg in Germany and Sweden, which is to say, on short trips. But after the First World War, she was transferred to the UK as compensation, as war reparation, and the ship was sold to the Hudson's Bay Company that assigned her in 1921 to its fur trading business in northern Canada. The Baychimo was now to travel along the north coast on long distances, visiting trading posts, collecting fur pelts, and trading supplies and provisions with the locals. The places where she went were only accessible by sea, and not all year round. In winter, the sea would freeze for several months, but for 10 years, the Baychimo successfully operated without major issues until 1931. North of Canada, many ships were trapped in the ice since the arrival of European explorers, and it is what happened to the Baychimo. In October 1931, as the weather was getting suddenly colder, and after the completion of a journey along the coasts of Victoria Island, the ship was trapped in pack ice. Pack ice, that is to say, sea ice that is not attached to the shoreline. This happens regularly. Drift ice is driven together into a large mass, a pack of ice, and this may happen around a ship in very cold waters. It is not necessarily that serious. Many ships and their crews have stayed trapped for months. Like this, just waiting for ice to melt so they could leave the place. And ships that served in this region were prepared for this possibility. The crew of the Baychimo realized that they would not be able to keep advancing, and they thought the ship would not go anywhere now that it was trapped. So they abandoned it temporarily, because they were just half a mile away from the shore, and there was a town, a place called Barrow, where they knew they would find better shelter. They spent 2 days in this town, and when they wanted to return to their ship, the Baychimo was no longer there. She had broken free of the ice and drifted to an unknown location, with no one on board to correct her course. This was embarrassing. Where was the ship? She was sighted again a few days later, south of where she was lost, and again she had been ice-packed at this new location. Days were passing, and winter would soon begin. The crew consisted of 37 men, too many to keep waiting until the ship could be freed. So the company sent a plane to evacuate 22 of them, and only 15 remained near the Baychimo on the land where they built a wooden shelter to wait for the ice to melt or to break and the ship to be retrieved. A few weeks passed, and by the end of November, there was a night of blizzard, and in the morning, the ship had disappeared again. It was thought to have broken up and sunk, but it was seen again a few days later, this time more than 40 miles south of where it had been lost. Once again, the Baychimo was prisoner of ice, and the crew thought that she would not survive this winter. So they retrieved the most valuable fur pelts on board to be transported by air, and the ship was willfully abandoned this time. By the end of 1931, the ship was 17 years old at this point, which was not that old for a steamship, but she was no longer new, and she had been acquired probably at a discount price. She was beginning to be outdated. Oil propulsion was quickly replacing coal and steam in the interwar period, and in particular in these cold regions, liquid fuel was way more convenient and efficient than coal. These are the reasons that probably explain the lack of motivation to save the Baychimo. And so the ship was abandoned to her fate and expected to sink quickly. Except she didn't. In circumstances that are unknown, the ship finally broke free, possibly several months later, and kept floating, starting a long journey without destination along the coasts of Canada and Alaska. For months, for years, and even for decades, she was seen multiple times in the 1930s and even boarded a couple of times, but she couldn't be rescued and was abandoned again. This continued in the 1950s and 60s. In 1962, she was seen drifting along the coast of the Beaufort Sea, which is the sea to the north of Alaska and the Canadian Northwest Territories. And for the last time, she was seen in 1969, 38 years after abandonment, frozen in another ice pack. After 1969 and since then, for more than 50 years now, there has been no signs of the Baychimo. She had been seen more than a dozen times in the 10 years after her abandonment, and not at all in the past 50 years, which is why the hypothesis that she sunk after 1969 sounds very likely. It would also make sense since in 1969 the ship was 55 years old, including 38 years of drifting at sea without any maintenance. So the breaking point of the hull in waters where she collided regularly with ice blocks was probably long overdue at this stage. And this is how the Baychimo disappeared. But we have no proof that this ghost ship actually sank. It sounds very unlikely that she would keep floating freely somewhere without having been noticed for more than 50 years. But she could have stayed stuck in high seas, covered in snow, and become invisible somewhere near Alaska or the icy shores of Canada. So, our night isn't over yet. I have a fourth story for you. Our story begins one day in December 1872 in the North Atlantic Ocean, off the Azores Islands. On the horizon, the crew of a Canadian commercial ship, the Dei Gracia, saw the sails of another ship of the same class, a brigantine, that is, a sailing ship with 2 masts. The other boat appeared to be in scruffy condition and adrift. So the Dei Gracia pulled closer. A closer observation confirmed that there was apparently no one on board. Several men from the Dei Gracia boarded the mysterious ship and observed that the lifeboat was missing. But other than that, there were still ample provisions on board. The ship was loaded with a cargo of denatured alcohol, meaning pure alcohol for industrial or medical use. And when they inspected the cabins, they saw that the crew's personal belongings were still there, some of them valuable. They also found the ship's logbook. The last entry was dated 10 days earlier. Like the Dei Gracia, the ship had left America, bound for Genoa, Italy, and the plan was to transport this cargo of alcohol across the Atlantic, then enter the Mediterranean Sea through the Strait of Gibraltar before reaching Italy. The name of the ship was Mary Celeste, and this was just the beginning of a puzzling mystery. Where does the Mary Celeste come from? Her keel had been laid 12 years earlier in Nova Scotia, Canada. Therefore, it was still a relatively new ship. At that time, in the 1860s and 1870s, Much of the transatlantic trade was still conducted by sailing ships. Steamships existed, but they had not yet replaced this means of transportation, which was cheaper, more well-known, and still more profitable. Modern shipping companies were just forming at the time, and they had not taken over maritime trade. So many independent ships and small companies secured most of the exchanges between Europe and America. The ship had been christened Mary Celeste 3 years earlier and was registered in the United States because, since 1861, she had sailed under the name Amazon as a Canadian ship, working primarily in the West Indian trade. But in 1867, 5 years before it was found by the Dei Gracia, it had been washed ashore in a storm near Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia and suffered so much damage that its owners abandoned it as a shipwreck. The wreck was sold several times on the cheap and ended up being owned by an American sailor from New York, who restored her and registered the ship under a new name, Mary Celeste, as an American vessel. It was sold again, and this time it was bought by a Massachusetts sea captain, Benjamin Briggs, who had acquired a good reputation in his profession and had decided to invest his savings in a ship. Briggs was experienced and perfectly capable of commanding such vessels. The Mary Celeste had just been refitted in New York. Her first voyage under the name Mary Celeste was to be a transatlantic crossing from New York City to Genoa, carrying a cargo of 1,700 barrels of alcohol. This was supposed to be a safe, almost routine voyage on a ship that had sailed for years before being wrecked and repaired. So much so that for her maiden transatlantic voyage under her new name and a new owner, Benjamin Briggs, he had arranged for his wife and daughter to travel with him. Apart from them, he had recruited a crew of 7 people, so there were 10 in total on board. In November 1872, the Mary Celeste set sail from New York Harbor for a voyage that was supposed to last a few weeks. A month later, she was found adrift and abandoned in the middle of the ocean. The loss of a ship due to weather or pirate attacks was not uncommon, but these 2 explanations seemed immediately unlikely in this case. The Mary Celeste had been undamaged. There was a bit of clutter on the deck and in the sails, but the ship was still seaworthy, much safer than a lifeboat. It made no sense to imagine an experienced captain ordering the evacuation of a perfectly navigable ship in the middle of the ocean to board a small, unstable lifeboat. Piracy also didn't work as an explanation because the personal belongings and ship's cargo were still there. There was no sign of a fight, and pirates operated near the coasts and islands, not in the middle of the Atlantic. Something was off, and no reason could be found for the abandonment. The Dei Gracia and the Marie Celeste were similar ships, so the captain sent part of his crew to the Mary Celeste, and the 2 ships sailed to Gibraltar, where he intended to have the salvage of the Mary Celeste acknowledged. This would entitle him the right to a substantial share of its value. An investigation and hearings were held in Gibraltar, confirming the mystery of the crew's disappearance. Months passed, and the lifeboat had not reappeared. It never would. The death, or at least the disappearance, of the 10 passengers and crew was confirmed. Why would an entire crew abandon a good ship along with its cargo? Several possible explanations were proposed. The first was foul play. What if the captain of De Gracia was, in fact, responsible for murdering and robbing the ship? Or what if he had conspired with Briggs, the captain and owner of the Mary Celeste, to organize an insurance fraud? It was suggested that the two captains could have known each other. They were both from the east coast of the United States, had the same profession, and were on the same route from the United States to Genoa. But this really didn't stand up to scrutiny. First of all, because the Mary Celeste had set sail several days earlier, and even if they were on the same route, the probability of the De Gracia finding it adrift was very slim. There was also the ship's logbook that had been interrupted 10 days before the salvage. This did not fit with the attack theory, and both captains were honorably known and certainly smart enough to organize a less complicated and ambiguous fraud if they had wanted to conspire. Another theory was that the entire crew may have feared an explosion and took refuge in the lifeboat. The cargo was alcohol, a highly explosive material, of course, and the wooden barrels would let the fumes escape. What if someone had lit something on deck, such as a lamp or a lighter, and caused an explosion due to gas buildup? Or if the density of the fumes had reached a point where it would detonate? A brief explosion would not necessarily have destroyed the ship, and could explain some of the disorder found on board. The rope tying the lifeboat to the ship had been cut, indicating a quick escape. So, in this case, the entire crew would have been afraid of a second, bigger explosion, and would have put distance between them and the ship. However, this was not entirely convincing. First of all, because no traces of burns were found, which is not totally incompatible with a brief explosion due to the fumes, but at least it is surprising and infrequent. In addition, Briggs knew what he was carrying, and these small explosions due to fumes detonating on ships loaded with oil or alcohol were common. They were not a structural risk, so panicked abandonment seemed untenable. If the reason wasn't internal, it could have been external. What about natural phenomena? A little water was found inside at the bottom of the ship, something that was not uncommon in wooden boats. There were pumps to evacuate it, so one theory was that perhaps a malfunction of the pumps could have caused alarm and prompted the evacuation. A sounding rod was found on deck, out of place. They may have used the rod to sound the water level inside the boat and been alarmed by an incorrect reading, indicating a much higher water level. This, combined with the fact that the pumps were not working, would have been truly alarming. That would have indicated that the ship was sinking. That's not impossible. But that would be a lot of coincidences and errors in judgment for a ship that was not visibly sinking. Again, this explanation is dubious. Other natural explanations include the possibility of a sea quake, an underwater earthquake that would have caused enormous turbulence. But again, you don't take refuge in a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean when you're on a ship that's still seaworthy. It would hurt their chances of survival and not improve them. What doesn't help build solid hypotheses is that in the decades that followed, a number of myths and false stories were added. Newspapers retold the story with made-up details. The press in the 19th century generally had little regard for truth and accuracy. Some newspapers changed the location of the salvage, for example, to other parts of the Atlantic Ocean, such as near the Cape Verde Islands. A supposed survivor spoke to the press in 1913, 41 years after the rescue, but it was a fraud. Stories of sea monsters also emerged, such as a giant squid that would have plucked off all the passengers, one by one, and taken the lifeboat for good measure. It was a revival of the legend of the Kraken, a giant octopus or squid that attacked ships. But as far as we know, the Kraken is a mythical creature. Other hypotheses include a moment of group hysteria, perhaps due to the fumes of alcohol. This is something that experts ruled out in an open deck, and so, without a definitive explanation, the case was closed. It was still suspicious, and the captain of the Dei Gracia was awarded only a small share of the salvage, reflecting the continuing suspicions against him in the hearings, although they were not proven. The Mary Celeste was finally shipped to Genoa and later sold at a discounted price due to its bad reputation. A partnership of New York businessmen bought it, and she continued its career for 11 more years, seemingly without incident, ending in 1884, 12 years after the salvage. The new owners of the time organized an insurance fraud. They filled the Mary Celeste with worthless cargo that was misrepresented as valuable goods on the ship's manifest, and they insured the cargo for $30,000, a small fortune at the time, equivalent to about 1 million of today's dollars. Then the ship was voluntarily wrecked off the coast of Haiti. Unfortunately for the owners, the insurance company's investigation quickly exposed the attempted fraud, and nothing was ever paid. On the contrary, the conspirators were tried for their crime. The Mary Celeste was no more, and to this day, the mystery of the loss of her crew and their rescue remains unexplained. We have reached the end of our journey in the wake of ghost ships. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep, or you can pick another story from my library if you don't feel sleepy yet. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.